All right, welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is The American West, and part two. And we're going to talk about five terms that, as you go to read more about this time period, you should kind of key in on these in order to really get a sense of the complexity of this period. I don't know about all of you, but when I was younger, I grew up in a house where we were kind of fed a steady diet of 1950s Westerns. So, of course, white guy cowboys was like the only thing that we would ever see. There's a lot more to it than that. And so it's important really for us to, again, get into this and get a sense of this. So, all right, number one, exodusters. All right, so exodusters were groups of African Americans at the end of the 1870s, early 1880s, who left the American South and the cyclical poverty of the post-war era and the brutal racial discrimination of the Jim Crow system that is forming and developing at that point to try to be able to create homesteads for themselves and their families at the end of the 1870s and 80s in places like modern Kansas. Number two, the Grange. So, 1870s, right? Now, the Grange is also known as the Patrons of Husbandry, and this was a community organization that was very popular in both the modern Midwest and in the American West and in other parts of the country as well. It existed primarily in rural areas and attracted a lot of individuals who were looking for community organization and development and building agricultural or rural communities at a time when they felt that those communities were kind of under attack or challenged or being changed in some way. So the Grange had a lot of activities, a lot of different things that they would do, from building schools to lobbying state governments to try to get better laws when it came to regulating railroads and rail prices for the shipment of grain and for other agricultural goods, commodities. And again, this was a popular organization in the 1870s, the Grange or the Patrons of Husbandry. Another phrase to be associated with this would be something called Grange laws or Granger laws. This would be another aspect of that. All right, number three, the Dawes Severalty Act. Now, this is passed in the 1880s, and it's a process by which, sadly, tribal sovereignty is basically going to be broken, where you see the taking of parts of reservations, the breaking of them, and the kind of giving out of the land as homesteads to families, and really is kind of a shift in parts of the mission of the government. Now, in many ways, it was seen as supposedly, by those who pushed for it, a more kind of philanthropic effort when it came to the treatment of Native Americans, but of course, in many ways, this is an institutional step towards cultural genocide. All right, number four, Yellowstone. So this Yellowstone Act, the first Yellowstone Act to kind of create this as a park, a national park, is in 1872, and like many other areas in the late 1800s, the creation of it as a park was designed to be able to protect it as you saw kind of the encroachment and kind of destruction of much of the beauty of the West in the second half of the 19th century. The harnessing of its resources by mining companies, by very, very, very large farming companies, and was kind of a difficult part of this story. And so protecting some of this with parks. So Ulysses S. Grant, President Grant does this. Later President Theodore Roosevelt, creates a lot of this with the national parks, obviously. But Yellowstone, 1872. All right. Fifth, boarding schools. So there was a movement in the second half of the 1800s that you could essentially take Native American children, indigenous children, and that you could make them become white. And it was a process whereby Native American children would be taken, would be removed from their families, would be brought to these schools, would be forced to cut their hair, would be forced to kind of put on what would be seen as stereotypical white clothing for men or for women, would be given language classes and schooling and instruction with the idea being that they would be then sent back into different communities and these were very, very, very difficult institutions, brutal institutions, which left kind of a lasting legacy. Perhaps the most noted of these was something called the Carlisle Boarding School, but there were many of them around the U.S. At that time. Thanks so much.